understand a man, you must know his memories. The same is true of a nation. There's an air of relaxation about China in the 1980s. The Cultural Revolution is over. Mao Tse Tung is dead. People now talk more about money than about communism. And there's more than there was to spend it on. To some people's alarm, it's starting to take on some of the superficial characteristics of the West. But below the surface, the attitudes of its people are still uniquely Chinese. Four out of 5 of all Chinese live and work on the land. In the countryside, there is a deep sense of continuity, of a routine that has hardly changed for generations. Life is centered around the village, the clan, the family. Their civilization goes back more than 5,000 years, but they have not been completely isolated. There have been important outside influences like Buddhism. For a third of the last 1,000 years, the Chinese have been under foreign rule. And yet, throughout history, they have preserved their own identity. Their culture has never been conquered by anyone. They have always felt their country to be the center of the world, the greatest nation under heaven. And heaven was power itself. Thunder in heaven is the noise of the dragon. He is the bringer of rain. To a nation of small farmers, packed close together on densely cultivated land, water is the most vital of all things. Enough rain will give a good harvest. Too little means famine. Too much can bring floods. So for thousands of years, the dragon has symbolized the power that can bring ordinary people prosperity or disaster, life or death. And that is the power that their rulers have also had over them. China has always been ruled from a single center. It is the oldest centralized state in the world. The Square of Heavenly Peace in Peking, at the heart of the old imperial city, is still the center of gravity of the nation, the place to which all the visitors come. And today's communist leaders, like the emperors before them, are faced with one fundamental question: how to rule over such a vast and varied mass of people and keep them united. One answer was provided more than 2,000 years ago by a ruler who gave us the word China, Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China. His tomb is near Xi'an in the northwest. It is said that an entire palace was built below the ground, and the floor was laid out as a vast map of China with moving rivers of mercury. The tomb has not yet been opened by archaeologists, but in 1974, some peasants digging a well in the fields nearby made an incredible discovery. They found life-size clay figures in the earth, hundreds of them, all in military uniform. More than 7,000 figures and 500 horses have been unearthed so far. A whole army, drawn up in battle formation, guarding the emperor's tomb a mile away. The faces, the armor, the headgear, all in exact detail, and frozen in time for 22 centuries. The Qin emperor drove the universe before him, said the historian. He scourged the world with his rod, and his might shook the four seas. The Qin emperor was a man of blood. His armies were ruthless and brutal. His achievement was to conquer China's warring feudal kingdoms and then weld them together by force into one entity. As he united the various states, he fenced them in. He joined up the northern defenses and built the Great Wall of China. What you can see today was built much later. It has never been a single wall running the entire length of northern China. But for 2,000 years, the Great Wall has stood as a symbol of unity, a boundary between the Chinese civilization inside and the barbarians beyond. It is also seen as a symbol of suffering and oppression. Every child in China is taught about the thousands of conscript laborers who were worked to their deaths to build the wall. The Chinese people have always been in two minds about the Qin emperor. In this painting, his eyes have been scratched out. He is hated for his cruelty and the ruthlessness with which he imposed uniformity. He was one of the first of the world's book-burning dictators. And he was one of the first to silence dissidents with brute force, allegedly burying intellectuals alive. But at the same time, the Chinese admire leaders with vision and strength. He may have had scant respect for human life, but at least he got things done, and he left his mark on history. The Qin emperor said his dynasty would last for 10,000 generations. In fact, it lasted 14 years. There are claims that this music was written by Confucius, a scholar and teacher who lived 3 centuries before the Qin emperor, around 500 BC. His influence has been vitally important in the history of China. He advocated a benevolent approach to government, and it was his teachings that the first emperor tried to suppress. For Confucius, the essence of government was the bringing about of a harmonious social hierarchy. He took the family as his ideal. The nation should be like a huge family with a father at its head. It should be governed not by force, but by moral example. The fundamental Confucian virtue was a sense of humanity and benevolence and respect for others, obedience to those above you and righteousness towards those below. The superior man should be honorable, educated, and cultured. Women should know their place. The Tang dynasty, over 1,000 years ago, is for the Chinese the golden age of music and art. Nowadays, they reconstruct the dances of the period in accordance with popular taste. Wall paintings in the tombs of the Tang emperors and their families have an atmosphere startlingly different from that of the first emperor's tomb. In place of oppressive militarism, there is now delicacy and sophistication and enjoyment of life. Around the same date as King Alfred was burning his cakes in a mud hut, Chinese society had elegance. It was wealthy, cosmopolitan. Some of the greatest of all Chinese poets, painters, and musicians lived at this time. The Tang dynasty is also remembered for its outstanding horsemen and for its brilliant administrators. The Chinese invented bureaucracy, and the Tang perfected a method of governing the country through a civil service that was highly organized and totally loyal to the emperor. It was a system unique to China, a means of ruling an immense number of people from a single point and of keeping all the power in the hands of the emperor. There's a saying in China, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. For ordinary people, the emperor was utterly remote. They paid his taxes, fought in his armies, were sometimes punished by his magistrates. And yet they saw him as far more than a mere human lawgiver. They believed that heaven had given the emperor a mandate to govern the world. His power came from heaven itself. Nobody ever questioned the need for it, just as nobody ever questioned the need for the sun. In satellite photographs of China, you can make out the neat rectangle that is Peking. This was once the greatest imperial city in the world. It was laid out over 500 years ago, like a grid on a north-south axis, and exactly in the center was the Forbidden City, where the emperor lived and reigned. The Forbidden City was where the four seasons merge, and earth and sky meet, and where all the forces of nature are in harmony. This, they believed, was the heart of the universe. The concept and the scale of the Forbidden City are breathtaking. Inside the walls are dozens of courtyards, hundreds of buildings, gardens, temples, rivers. 250 acres laid out with geometric precision and symbolic proportion. The great halls were the most splendid ever to have been built in China, and the formal ceremonies that took place in them were as magnificent and awe-inspiring as anything that could be imagined. Behind the ceremonial palaces, another wall enclosed the actual living quarters of the imperial family. The emperor's wife and concubines were virtual prisoners behind this gate. Apart from the eunuch servants and ministers summoned by the emperor, any man found inside was put to death. Wherever you look, there are dragons, the supreme symbol of the emperor's status. Only the emperor could pass up the middle of the center stairways, carried above the dragons in a sedan chair. Only the emperor could have walls painted purple-red, a color associated with the pole star. And only the emperor could have golden yellow roof tiles, the color of the sun. The concentric layout of the Forbidden City was symbolic of the universe. At the heart of it is the grandest building of all, where the emperors presided over the most solemn ceremonies, the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The emperor had awesome authority. He was answerable only to heaven. He alone sat facing south. His personal name was so sacred that no one was even allowed to utter its sound. Just to look him in the face was to risk punishment by death. He would wear a dragon robe on important occasions. This one is made from peacock feathers, embroidered with silk and decorated with pearls and coral. The clouds around the dragons are a reminder of his celestial authority. The emperor was seen as head of the entire human race, its father. His subjects, his children, owed him unquestioning obedience. The ceremonial that surrounded him was elaborate and meticulous. It was a representation of the Confucian ideal of a perfectly structured society, like a pyramid, with the emperor at the very top. Each official had a specific rank in the hierarchy, his own function in the pyramid of power. Among the hundreds of buildings of the inner palace, there's a group called the 6 Western Halls. They are on a more human, more intimate scale. It was here that the emperors of the 18th and 19th centuries worked and ate and slept. It was a strange, exotic world, a world of eunuchs and serving women, of beautiful concubines and exquisite works of art. Many of the emperors were passionate collectors. The finest craftsmen all over the world were commissioned to make their priceless toys, and they surrounded themselves with gold. These treasures are from the private collection of the Qianlong Emperor, perhaps the most wealthy and powerful of them all. When he began his long reign in 1736, China was the strongest, richest, and most populous nation on earth. The Chinese emperor was no mere figurehead. From this modest office, Qianlong governed his vast empire and made decisions that affected the lives of a quarter of the world's population. Here he would receive a constant stream of ministers and advisors, and reports from his magistrates all over the country would be annotated in the vermilion ink that only the emperor could use. All the important decisions were made by him alone. Above his throne were the words balanced, upright, benevolent, harmonious. These were the fundamental Confucian virtues which a ruler was expected to display. The ideal was that the absolute and terrifying power of the emperor should be balanced by his inner wisdom and his fatherly care for his subjects. It was, of course, an ideal that few emperors, even the great Qianlong, lived up to in practice. And yet, throughout history, the ideal was there. It survived tyrants and idiots, bloodshed and chaos, foreign invasions and rebellions. It even survived the end of imperial rule in China, this longing for a godlike ruler, all-powerful and all-wise. Nowadays, the Chinese talk about the lost generation, the children of Mao Tse Tung's Cultural Revolution. Living memory is vivid, and you don't have to be very old in China to have suffered your share of the turbulence of the 20th century. Most people remember the late 1930s and 40s as a nightmare of chaos and bloodshed. The Japanese invasion and occupation of a large part of China, the millions who died at their hands. Civil war in the 1940s between the ruling Nationalist Party and the Communists. The rise of Mao Tse Tung, the charismatic revolutionary leader. It was a vicious war, fought with bitterness and hatred and appalling casualties. And as usual in a civil war, the civilians suffered most. Communist victory in 1949. Dramatic memories of the day when Mao climbed the gate of heavenly peace in front of the Forbidden City and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. They called it liberation, the start of the socialist revolution. Then land reform, burning the title deeds, bitter retribution against the landlords, their land distributed among the peasants. This was to be, they all hoped, the start of a new society. In the 50s, the reconstruction of the country, destitute after decades of foreign occupation and war. Almost the only resource they had was manpower, by the million. In the mid-50s, the new communist rulers of China had consolidated their power and began to plan for the future. Their unquestioned leader was Mao Tse Tung. Their task was to create harmony and bring about prosperity for the people. That had always been the emperor's duty. But the communist vision had another dimension. Mao wanted to transform the whole of Chinese society into something radically different, classless, unselfish, idealistic as well as prosperous. And to do that, he planned to mobilize the entire country. In 1958, he launched what he called the Great Leap Forward. Its object was to carry the nation forward overnight towards the ideal communist society. From now on, there would be no more individual ownership of land. The peasants were to collectivize, to work not just in family or village units, but in communes of many thousands of people. Everyone would share the same work, the same food, the same pay. As well as agriculture, every village would undertake industrial work. Mao imposed his policy, even though it disrupted the old patterns of rural life. He hoped the peasants would be motivated to work towards his new society. But he was proved wrong. Impossible targets and bad management led to chaos in the communes. Grain was left to rot because no one had thought about transport. Without incentives, not many people showed the selfless devotion that Mao was asking for. The result was disaster. Abnormally bad weather made things worse. There were typhoons and serious floods and a nationwide crisis. The Chinese have since said that about 20 million people died as a result of food shortage. Many people have bitter memories of Mao's great experiment. The Chinese way of life is resistant to sudden change. A nation of villages, with the family as the basic social and economic unit, could not be changed overnight into a society with communal motivation. A free market like this, where the peasants can nowadays sell their own produce, would never have existed if Mao had had his way. He saw it as heresy to offer people individual rather than collective incentives. But other leaders argued that he was being too inflexible. What does it matter, said Deng Xiaoping, if the cat is black or white, so long as it catches the mice? But for Mao, the color of the cat mattered desperately. It had to be red. By 1966, he was getting old. He had lost face after the Great Leap Forward, and he wanted to get even with his enemies in the party. He still dreamed of creating his revolutionary utopia. This time, he looked to the young generation. They were not tainted by the bad influences of the past. They had energy and enthusiasm enough to become his instruments. And in the summer of 1966, Mao raised the curtain on the final and most spectacular act of his reign, the great proletarian cultural revolution. On the gate of heavenly peace, Mao stood in glory like an emperor. He knew his people. He understood their longing for a leader whom they could see as omnipotent and infallible. The parades in the autumn of 1966 were stage-managed to inspire emotion and awe. Their like had never before been seen. Among the other party leaders on the platform was Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. The whole nation, it seemed, was being swept away on a tide of revolutionary frenzy. "10,000 years," they shouted to Mao, a greeting that used to be reserved for emperors. They called him the Great Helmsman, the red sun which will never set in our hearts, the lighthouse of the revolution, dearer to us than our own fathers. The campaign to elevate Mao to the status of a god was carefully orchestrated. An entire generation was manipulated to idolize him. His sayings were printed in a little red book, which became Holy Writ, to be studied and chanted and learnt by heart. If you couldn't quote from it accurately, you risked a beating up from your friends. Mao called his young supporters his Red Guards. He believed that revolution could only come about through turmoil, and promised them that if they would help him tear the old structure of society into little bits and throw them in the air, the communist dream would come true. The Red Guards marched into every corner of China to spread the gospel of revolution. In some cities, they decided in their enthusiasm that traffic lights had to be reversed. In the new society, red should mean go. Everything to do with the past had to be changed. Names of shops and restaurants, street signs. They destroyed everything they could find that reminded them of the old traditions. Museums, palaces, works of art. Especially anything to do with Confucius, whose teachings were said to symbolize the feudal past. But the main target of the Cultural Revolution were those who belonged to the educated and managerial class. Most of them were forced to go and work on the land. It would teach them a lesson. Mao had always mistrusted intellectuals and bureaucrats, and a campaign of hatred was started. It was spearheaded by a group of extremists who had won his favor. While Mao appeared to take a back seat, they ran the country like dictators. Eventually, they became known as the Gang of Four. Their leader was Mao's own wife, Jiang Qing. The writer, Xiao Chen, was luckier than some. At least he survived. He had already spent years in a labor camp in the 1950s for publishing his opinions. In the Cultural Revolution, he was attacked. His house was smashed, his books and papers burnt, much of the work of a lifetime destroyed.
Jiang Qing and his gang started burning all our classics. And then they started to murder people. We knew that this wasn't revolution. This was sheer murder.
It was a time of terror. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, party officials were attacked and humiliated. Many were tortured or driven to suicide or murdered. Mao had dreamed of creating utopia. Instead of that, he created hell. The economy disintegrated, the entire country came to a standstill. Mao Tse Tung died in 1976, 10 years after he had launched the Cultural Revolution. The nation was stunned and bewildered. They had believed in the great helmsman. They had turned him into a god. Now, not only was he dead, but the country was in ruin. The all-wise and all-powerful leader had turned out to be fallible after all. And like an enormous shoal of fish, the population seemed to change direction as one. Everything was blamed on the Gang of Four. Jiang Qing and the rest of the Gang of Four, together with their main supporters, were arrested and brought to trial. The grim statistics emerged. The People's Daily estimated that at least 100 million people had suffered during the 10 years. The members of the Gang of Four were accused of being personally responsible for 34,000 deaths. Mao himself was left out of the accusations. In the past, the emperor's mistakes were often blamed on bad advisors. And this was not the first time in history that the finger of guilt was pointed at a scheming woman. Jiang Qing was unashamed.
毛泽东主席的妻子38年整了，认识还不止，共患难了。战争的时候，唯一留在前方追随毛泽东主席的，只有我一个女同志。你们躲到哪儿去了？
判处被告人将其死刑。
革命万岁！
As Jiang Qing and the other defendants were sentenced, it was taken for granted that the leaders, not the people, should bear the blame. No one asked, at least in public, how it was that so many millions had allowed themselves to be led astray by a handful of extremists. They began to build a great marble mausoleum to enshrine Mao's body. They put it up in the center of the Square of Heavenly Peace, exactly along the north-south axis that had been sacred to the emperors. The workmen who built the Qin Emperor's tomb 22 centuries ago can't have looked much different from this. Mao, like the first emperor, had changed history. He created a new China. But like his distant predecessor, he was unable to wipe out the past. The new leaders said he had made mistakes, though he was still the great hero of the revolution. It was not easy to know what to think. On a busy Sunday nowadays, perhaps 80 or 90,000 visitors will walk through what was once the Forbidden City. Many families will have traveled up from the country to gaze at these monuments to the authority of the emperors.
并让大家有一个舒适的参观环境。我们热切希望各位观众在参观中协助。
For the Chinese, history is not an objective account of the past. It's a lesson for the future, a morality tale. And it's the state that always points the moral. Only a few years ago, they were told that all this imperial splendor symbolized an oppressive authority that masqueraded as divine, an oppression from which Mao Tse Tung had set them free. Now they are told that Mao himself took on a godlike authority, and in the Cultural Revolution, they themselves experienced the consequences. But their long history has made them as philosophical about their rulers as they are about the weather. At times benevolent, at times oppressive, always subject to change. Life for ordinary people in China is very deeply rooted. They have a sense of the greatness of their country. They feel the continuity of generations. Their lives are centered around their families. These are the timeless things that give the Chinese people such resilience, whichever way the dragon veers.